Okay, this is just a hopefully brief explanation of how to do something that you're going to need to do in one of your homework problems. I I just spent a couple of hours trying to record something that wound up being a half hour long to explain this, and it was just too much. So I'm going to just go through what's called MACRS, MACRS. It's an accelerated depreciation. It is widely used in the business world, in my experience, almost universally. So we have gone through how to use straight line depreciation calculations. I've shown you how to use Excel's depreciation function for straight line. And what I just want to show you now is how to set up a MACRS calculation just without going through a ton of attempts to explain what's in it. Just because it just goes on too long. Okay, so here's how I want you to do this. Okay, first of all, we have to have a timeline, right? And then the timeline has to have the years numbered, 1, 2, 3, etc. Okay, so this is years. And then, you can copy this out for as many years as you want. Let's have it go for 10 years. And how about we put these into the center of the cell just so that it looks like they go together. Copy the word year out, and we will be set to go with our timeline. Now, MACRS is an accelerated depreciation schedule, and we use a function called VDB. Okay. The arguments in the VDB function are, where'd it go? Cost, so the asset cost, the depreciable base, the salvage value, which is always 0 in MACRS, the estimated life, and then these two arguments that are kind of hard to explain, start period and end period, and then the factor, which varies depending on the year, the asset class year of the asset, and then this no switch argument is not needed for these calculations. Okay, so what I want to do first is just set up an input table, and this is what I suggest that you do. Okay, so we have a cost and the life and the salvage, which is 0 for MACRS, and then the factor. And we are going to talk about start period and end period in a minute. Okay, so for our example in the book, we had a cost of $81,000 and an expected life of 5 years for that example. The salvage, like I said, is 0 for MACRS. Now, the factor argument is it's 2. It's the number 2 for asset lives under 15 years. And it's 1.5 for 15 year plus. Okay. So how can we make that as an argument in Excel? Okay, so let's make an argument that says if the asset life expectancy is less than 15 years, then we say 2. Otherwise, we say 1.5. So we go if the life less than 15, then it's 2. Otherwise, 1.5. So that's easy. Okay, so let's just check this by, yep, so it worked. So we'll change that back to 5. Okay. Okay, so thus far, we have out of the arguments for the VDB function, okay, we have these arguments mostly set up. Okay. But we still need to deal with the start period and the end period. So let's escape out of here And I just want to go down a couple of lines here and show you how the start period and end period are set up. Now, the basis for all of this is that MACRS assumes that you purchase the asset halfway through the first year. So we don't start depreciating until halfway through the first year. Okay? The actual calculation of the start period requires that your starting period for the period that we're thinking about depreciating, it's the year minus 1.5. Okay, so the start period is a year minus 1.5. That means that we're assuming that, we purchased this asset in the middle of the first year. We're going to apply a year's depreciation for it, or actually we're going to apply a half a year's depreciation for it, right? So we're only going to apply a half a year's depreciation in that first year. The ending period is the year minus 0.5. Okay, so that's, we're only going to apply a half a year's depreciation in the first year, not 0.5, 0.5. Okay. All right, so the start period here, right, we have our years set up by numbers, and our start period then is the number minus 1.5. And our ending period is the year minus 0.5. So far, so good. So we're going to apply a half a year's depreciation for year one, but what happens is we get an error message. So let me add a couple of more lines here. Okay, and we want to avoid for the ending, right? Because we can't have a negative year. That'll give us an error in the calculation. So we need to avoid that error message by saying that our starting time is going to be either 0 or the year minus 1.5. Okay, so it's going to be either 0 or the year minus 1.5, depending on which is bigger. So we're going to say it's going to be the maximum, mac of 0 and the year minus 1.5. So it's going to return 0 for that first year. And if we copy this formula, actually both of these formulas out for a couple of years, all right? Now it returns the 0.5, and we could pull that out, right? So this is what we want to use as our input into the arguments for the function. Okay. Likewise, okay, we can't be depreciating our asset for longer than it lives. Now remember, we're assuming that we have purchased the asset in the middle of the first year. So we are going to have some depreciation in that 6th year, because we have to still use, we assume like in June that we're still paying depreciation on what we bought in the middle of the first year. But after that, this should be 0 after that, right? So now what we do is we take the minimum of the life of the asset, taken as an absolute cell reference, or the number that we calculated above for the ending period. Like that. So the ending period remains 5. Okay. Now this should work. So let's go ahead and figure out our depreciation expense using MACRS. Okay, here's the formula. VDB. Cost is 81,000. Salvage is 0. The life is the life. Let's go ahead and make those absolute column references. The start period is this thing that we calculated so we would avoid the error message here, and that we are not going to make an absolute reference because we want it to move. And the end period is this one here that we calculated. And then the factor is down here, and that is an absolute cell reference. Okay, fingers crossed. 16.2. Let's see what we get. Okay, so here are our calculations. It worked correctly for 6 years because this is a 5-year asset, and that assumes that we purchased it in the middle of the first year, and so we still have some depreciation expense in the 6th year, a half a year's worth, right? Now, that worked, but watch what happens when we pull this out into the future. Okay. We get error messages, and then here we have a 0, and the reason why we have a 0 is because of this, right? And actually, if we pull these out, that error message will continue. Okay, you see? So, I know this is working right because it's returning me an error message when I expect to see one. As a matter of fact, let's change the life here to 3 years and see what it looks like. Yeah, then our error message starts in the 5th year. So if we have an estimated life of 3 years, we're still paying half a year's worth of depreciation in the 4th year. And if we add up all these numbers, it does add up to 81,000. So this is working properly. But if you go to use this in a financial model, you'll wind up with this error message carrying through. Okay, so for a professional model, you need to have a little, just a little change to your formula, such that it will return a 0 if you have an error showing up, right? So this is not strictly necessary. I'll make it italic. So you don't necessarily have to do this piece, but I'll show you how, just because that's how I roll, right? So we'll say if error. Okay. So if this number, what this formula does is it says, okay, give me a value unless there's an error, and then give me something else. Okay? So you say if error, return that calculated value for the depreciation, otherwise return 0. So this, my friends, should work. Right, so here we have a calculation of depreciation expense, which returns 0 if we're beyond the useful life of the asset. Yeah. But it will return the depreciation expense, so you can use either one. And then the other thing is, let's extend this out a few more years, up to 15 years, just so that we can test and see whether our factor switch works. Let's take that out to 16 years. Copy these formulas. Copy all of these formulas, I guess. And then if I say that the life is 15 years, let's do it for one more year because we're still paying depreciation in year 16. So let's do it in year 17. We're getting that error message as expected. We're getting the 0, and if we add up all these numbers, it should continue to add up to 81,000, which it does. So that, my friends, is how you do MACRS, which you will need to do for one of your homework problems. Okay.